Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our November program for the Minnesota Peace Initiative. Welcome back to all of you who have been here at previous programs, and I see a lot of regulars, so we really appreciate it. And also a welcome to those of you who are here for your first time. For those of you who are attending for your first time, let me tell you who we are and why we do these programs. The Minnesota Peace Initiative is part of the Norway House. Norway and our Norwegian ancestors have a long tradition as peacemakers. Norway is often a trusted, neutral, global partner asked to help resolve differences and bring parties in conflict to the negotiating table. Therefore, as part of the Norway House, we seek to provide a forum for thoughtful discussions of current issues and conflicts, where we can listen and learn from each other. In our politically divided culture, as we just saw last week, we often want to say we need to listen to each other more, and this is an opportunity to do so. The goal of the Minnesota Peace Initiative is to delve deeply into challenging global issues of our day. Like James Madison, we believe a well-informed electorate is essential for an effective democracy. We bring you experts to share their knowledge and their insights so we can become better informed and on important, timely topics. Past programs have included Arab Spring, conflict in the Ukraine, the impact of social media on world events, plastics in our oceans, and the power of educating women and girls to create stability in emerging nations. This is, I think, our 8th year of doing Minnesota Peace Initiative programs. And if you had told me at that time that one of our future topics would be the degeneration of democracy, I would have been shocked. The thought would never have crossed my mind. In fact, I would have thought the opposite. With the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union, questioning the viability of democracy would have seemed to be the least likely topic for our Minnesota Peace Initiative programs. And yet, here we are. In the last 2 years, with the election of Donald Trump, the Brexit vote in the UK, the rise of China as an economic juggernaut, and the rise of dictators and nationalist parties, we are seeing tremendous challenge to the ongoing viability of our Western alliances and institutions. Democracy, as the chosen form of government, has been on the rise for 40 years. However, now, would others really choose democracy as their preferred form of self-government, or would they look to other models? These changes in our world have come very quickly. Our goal tonight is to ask what these changes mean for the future of democracy. Does democracy need to change or adapt? Do alternative forms of governing just come and go, so we just have to ride it out? For instance, in the 1930s, we saw the rapid rise of fascism around the world, and yet, 15 years later, all the fascist governments were gone. And democracy was spreading rapidly around the world. History doesn't always repeat itself, but it is foolish not to see what lessons we can draw from history. Our two speakers tonight are Dr. Jonas Bergan Draege from Norway, a postdoctoral fellow at the JFK School of Government at Harvard University, and Professor Elaine Tyler May, Regents Professor of American Studies and History and Chair of the History Department, College of Liberal Arts, right here at the University of Minnesota. We're looking forward to an evening of thought-provoking discussion. This is not just about who did what, when, and where. It's more about how do you connect the dots, and when you do, what do you see? Joining us also will be Tom Hanson, who is both a valuable and valued member of our Minnesota Peace Initiative Planning Committee. And he is a valuable asset for our state and our community. Tom is a former U.S. State Department diplomat whose expertise and experience is in Russia and Eurasia. He is currently the diplomat in residence with the Royal Allworth Institute of International Studies at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. He will give an overview of what's going on and how he connects the dots. Each of our panelists, as you know, for those of you who've been here before, will give a brief opening statement. Then I will ask them a few questions to get the program going, and then we will turn it over to questions from you, the most important part of our program. Cards will be passed out as we have always done before, and so you can write your questions and they will be brought up, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. I do want to clarify our schedule. We will end promptly at 8:30. As I said before we started, we respect your time and we want to make sure that we are done on time. Although our speakers are available afterwards if anyone wants to stay and ask a question or talk to them. Before I turn it over to Tom, I would like to comment on the attendance tonight. I am so glad to see you all here. I was worried, and the reason I was worried is I was afraid that our country is complacent about our democracy. I think that we've only known democracy. All of us, no matter what our age. This is the only thing we've grown up with. So we assume, at least for our country, that it will always be there. But we know that's not true. We've had democracies in the past. They've come and they've gone. And this one will go too, if we don't work to keep it vibrant and satisfying the needs of the governed. Democracy is a choice, and the governed can choose another form at any time. I do want to say there's a lot in the news, and we'll hear a lot tonight about the rise of concern about our democracy. And none of us want to be a henny penny. We don't want to be running around saying the sky is falling when it really isn't. But on the other hand, we can't afford to be an ostrich, burying our head in the sand when there are very serious crosswinds blowing. People get the government they deserve. And if we want a strong democracy, we all have to be aware of the challenges and then meet them head on. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Tom. As I said, Tom is a former diplomat. He has served in East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. I've mentioned this before when I've introduced Tom, but Tom probably has the most interesting and exciting life of all of us. Part of that is because he's never here, summer or winter. Every time I call him, he's somewhere else. But anyway, he's very well traveled. He speaks all around the world on all kinds of subjects around governance and diplomacy, and we're very lucky to have him here to give us an overview of this topic. Tom.
Well, thank you so much, Janet, and welcome everyone. Our topic tonight, the degeneration of democracy. Is it really happening? What are the factors that are involved? We all know that issues like immigration and nationalism are part of the mix. In fact, you can have disagreements on immigration, you can have a slightly nationalistic feeling and still have a democracy. If issues like that become too acute, of course, it can become a threat to democracy, and we may be seeing some of that today. But there are other issues that I think are also important. We're living in a time of tremendous change. Globalization, we're just really seeing the effects of the past 40 years of globe-spanning supply chains, interaction between capital and labor that are having a deep impact on workers in each individual country. I'll be describing some of the technological change that's underway. Upheavals this intense lead to identity issues for people. People need to find an identity somewhere. And all of these issues are at play here. This is these rabbit holes go extremely deep. So I will try to, in my brief remarks now, just offer a few reflections on some of these issues. Freedom House, which monitors the state of democracy in the world each year, in its 2018 report said, quote, "Democracy faced its most serious crisis in decades in 2017 as its basic tenets came under attack around the world." As Janet pointed out, just a few decades ago, it seemed as if democracy was finally on the march. It was the end of history, collapse of the Soviet Union, what they call the unipolar moment. There was the feeling that that our institutions, the Washington Consensus, as it was called, had come to dominate. And it's amazing how quickly this shift has taken place. There's a political scientist at Princeton, John Eikenberry, who's been a believer in the sort of momentum behind our institutions, the liberal international order. He's having to rethink all this. And in his latest book, he asked the question, what is happening? Obviously, the triumphalist era of democracy is over. Is this temporary, merely a leadership problem, rather, where you can, whether it's Erdogan in Turkey or Orban in Hungary or our situation here at home, arguably, is this just a passing leadership phase? Is it a transition to a new order of some kind in which democracy will continue after a few bumps? Or is this the crisis of liberalism and democracy themselves? Are we seeing the end of a 200-year arc of history as new forms of governance emerge and outperform democracy? It's hard to know, which way it's going, and so he is just saying there are three ways forward. History is not yet written. So what we're discussing today, these are adumbrations, these are the trends we're seeing around us, which have not yet fully developed into the future. So Jimmy Carter recently gave a speech in which he said that America is no longer a democracy. It is an oligarchy. And that brings me to the first factor, which is inequality. Kishore Mahbubani, a very esteemed analyst at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Governance in Singapore, recently wrote an article in which he said, you have to make distinctions depending on where you're studying. Europe, he said, if they're having a populist movement there, anti-democratic, it's because of immigration. In the United States, he said, it's because of plutocracy. That's the reason here. You've got to make these fine distinctions. One of the best books on the crisis of democracy is by a young scholar at Harvard named Yascha Mounk, called The People versus Democracy. And his basic point is this: democracy does not depend on values. Values are wonderful things, but more important is economic performance, the daily lives of people. And the problem, he said, is that the economies of Western countries are becoming dislocated and that this is an automatic threat to democracy. He points out that in the 1970s, the top 1% in the U.S. had about 8% of pre-tax income. Today, it's over 20% and growing. This was before the recent tax cuts that he wrote this book. And he says this is clearly a threat to democracy. You know, in the ancient world, Aristotle, Plato, and others believed that systems succeeded each other. There was a natural cycle of systems. Oftentimes, democracy gave way to oligarchy, and that the only thing that kept any of these various systems of governance somewhat stable was the existence of a strong middle group, middle class, and that any system becomes destabilized when that does not exist. Yascha Mounk's other point is that, for better or worse, autocratic regimes today are beginning to outperform democracies in economic development. They're able to plan long term. Authoritarian capitalism is coming to seem very, very attractive to developing countries, whether in the Arab and Gulf states, East Asia. He claims, and I'd like to see the statistics on this, that of the 15 countries with the highest per capita income today, 2/3 are non-democratic. In other words, the road to prosperity no longer leads through liberal democracy. And of course, here we'll be coming to the China model toward the end of my remarks. You know, back at the end of World War II, a working class individual named Erich Hofer wrote a book called The True Believer. It was Eisenhower's favorite book. He came from the working class, and he analyzed what had led Europe and other countries to tumble into fascism, to go against democracy. And he said the key group is what he called the new poor. It's not the abject poverty group that is going to embrace fascism. It's people who have been up toward the middle and who find themselves sliding down into a lower status. That's the group. That's the group that produced fascism in Europe. He said that the United States had, because of the New Deal and other things, had escaped this shift, which had happened elsewhere in the world. But he said if ever the United States begins to neglect its middle class, it will face exactly the same dynamics. The idea of inequality, of course, is beyond just any nation state. Adam Smith wrote in 1776, the great defender of free markets, that while the proprietor of land, a landowner, is necessarily a citizen of a particular country in which his estate lies, the proprietor of stock is properly a citizen of the world and is not necessarily attached to any particular country. And we do have a sense of a global elite that is forming now. It includes various sectors. It includes media. It includes the arts. And when you look at Brexit and when you look at what's happening in the EU, this is very much a part of what's happening there. There's a movement underway in Europe that's geared to the May European parliamentary elections. The populists and nationalists of Europe want to create a tsunami in those elections to show that their strength is predominant in Europe. The Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Salvini, who is a populist, said recently, "The European elections next year will be a referendum between the Europe of the elites, of banks, of finance, of immigration, of precarious work, against the Europe of people and labor. Our project consists in creating an international league of populists." And their main advisor in this effort is Steve Bannon, who has spent all of his time in Europe in recent months and is helping advise the parties of Europe, the anti-democratic parties, how to do this. One final point on this, what I think, salient point, the fact that any democracy that allows its middle class to decline is in for trouble. Nils Gilman of the University of California, Berkeley, he's associate dean there, recently wrote a book called The Twin Insurgency, saying there are two insurgencies right now away from democracy globally. The first is from below. It's an interconnected criminal insurgency of global drug cartels, arms dealers, human traffickers, who are carving out what he calls their own micro-sovereignties. If you go to Mexico today, whole parts of Mexico are ruled by the cartels. The state has receded. That's the insurgency from below. From above, it's a plutocratic insurgency. It's a globalized elite seeking to disengage from traditional national obligations and responsibilities. Unlike the classic 20th century insurgents who sought to take over government or the state, these insurgents seek to cripple the state, not to take it over, to weaken it to the point where they can continue on their activities. Their aim is to carve out de facto zones of autonomy for themselves, what he calls the enclavization of micro-sovereignties, whether these are gated communities or provinces of Mexico, and it is this dual insurgency which is bringing down the system. And we're all being dragged down with it, in his estimation. Now, another aspect here is the simple factor of civic education. When I was in school, there was a 9th grade civics. There was a national sense that you had to inculcate each new generation with a sense of what democracy is. And I think that there's a question today of whether that's still being done. This brings the media in because an informed citizenry depends on a media that is functioning in the national interest. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, I'm quoting here from a book by some Washington Post journalists written in the 90s. Government, political, foreign, and other news was largely supplanted in our media by crime, weather, health, consumer, investor, entertainment, and other news believed to be of more interest to viewers and readers in their personal lives. Celebrities and news you can use. There was a drawing back from actual reporting of the news, and we all have existed in this fragmented infotainment environment ever since. If you look at the two great dystopian books of the 20th century, Orwell's Brave New World, Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World, they each feared an end to democracy, but the scenario was different. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed. Big Brother would be taken from us and concealed. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned out in a sea of irrelevance, creating a population too narcoticized, stupefied by undisguised trivialities to engage as responsible citizens. And there could well be, it's not just fake news, it's also the news itself. And as Hannah Arendt said in The Origins of Totalitarianism, democracy ends when the masses come to believe that everything is possible and nothing is true. Now, the other factor in this is something goes way back, I think, on our history, is the relative isolation of our individual citizens today in the face of the new technology. Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America predicted that the main threat to American democracy would eventually be the isolation of its citizens, that the individualism at the heart of our democracy would eventually become our bane. And when you add to this the new media, which is further isolating, as Robert Putnam's famous book, Bowling Alone, talked about how TV already had eroded the ties between us by encouraging people to spend less time participating in shared activities. And as Malcolm Gladwell has pointed out, the new social media does not inspire deep commitments needed to act for social change. It creates an echo effect that further isolates the population. All these are huge factors that are at play in our society today. Now, the final point that we're dealing with right now is indeed the emergence of other models, of other forms of governance. You know, our idea was in engaging China that they would become responsible stakeholders. In a sense, they would become like us if we engaged with them and brought them into the WTO, into the world economy. Well, China is an ancient civilization. It has its own way of doing things. And that is beginning now to emerge as they rise economically. A primary goal in Chinese civilization, going all the way back, is harmony. It's not individualism. It's the harmony among an ever-changing reality, within an ever-changing reality. And it's leading China today to create a whole new form of governance, which may or may not emerge as the dominant form in the 21st century. They firmly believe that the new technologies, AI, facial recognition technology, all of these things can be harnessed into governance to perfect central planning to make for a better ordered society. And so they are in the process of creating what they call a social credit system, which will be implemented in 2020, in which the population will be monitored for its own good, online, obviously, through facial recognition, other things. Each citizen will receive a social credit score each quarter or half year, and on the basis of that score, we'll have rewards and punishments immediately. Maybe you won't be able to travel, you'll lose your passport, or you'll have access to other things, in the name of harmony in the society. Obviously, for us, this is a very different way of doing things, something that's hard to wrap our minds around. But as this kind of governance emerges, it's, in my view, too early to say which form will appear more compelling. The stakes are high. The democracy that we all believe in is still vibrant, but all the factors I've just described make it more important than ever to be vigilant and to take what we have, what we've inherited from our ancestors, seriously. Thank you very much. We're going to transition now. I'm going to invite our two primary speakers to join me here, Jonas Bergan Draege from the Belfer Center at Harvard. If you would come up, and Elaine Tyler May from the University of Minnesota, historian of the United States, expert on the effect of the Cold War now on our democracy. Welcome, both of you. And I'll now turn the floor over to Janet again.
You know, when your opening speaker throws the word dystopia into their opening remarks, it's a sobering opening for our program. I thought our program on plastics in the ocean was the most depressing we had, but this is, I think this is going to give it a run for its money. So, all right. Well, good evening, everyone. And again, I want to thank both of our guests for joining us. And I'm going to begin with my question here. Dr. Draege, and again, thank you very much. I know you didn't literally fly here from Norway, but as part of the Norway House, we are always very happy when we have panelists who has links to Norway. So we thank you for being here. So we appreciate it. Now you may regret that because we aren't there and you are in terms of Europe. And we don't expect you to speak for everybody in Europe, but could you give us kind of a quick Cook's tour? I mean, we saw a little bit this weekend with the gathering in Paris. We heard today that there's a provisional agreement between the EU and the UK on Brexit, so it's an evolving. It seems like something's happening every day. But can you just give us, as an expert in government and governance, what you're seeing going on over there in terms of the challenge to the democracy?
Do you want me to do that?
No, you could just use your microphone. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think.
You're supposed to give your opening statement.
Yeah,
we got to get organized here. I'm so excited to get to questions that I'm going to invite you to give your opening, and you can stand up here. We're going to give brief openings because it helps you get grounded in terms of who our speakers are, and then we'll get to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here too. I did not fly in from Norway, but that is where I was born and raised, so my credentials are clear. I'm very happy to be in Minneapolis and in Minnesota. I have lived in places in the world where stereotypes and do affect people, and they are negative, and I deeply believe that you should not judge people based on stereotypes. My main work is on the Middle East, and as you know, there are a lot of people who hail from the Middle East who struggle with that. But sometimes stereotypes are correct, and I think when it comes to Minnesota, the stereotypes of people being polite and nice, I think that's 100% accurate so far in my case. When I was studying English, or when I was studying and I started writing in English and writing emails in English, I signed off in English, and I tried to do it in the polite manner. I thought that was best wishes or sincerely. But I learned a new one from Janet. She writes, very, very truly yours. That's what she writes. I think that's incredibly polite, and I really appreciate that. I think this is a great opportunity to talk about democracy, and I really thank Tom for pointing out some of the issues we are facing today. And this is a great opportunity for me to talk about it before I go back into my cave and my bubble to write about the depressing state of democracy in Turkey. So, listening to Janet's opening statement, I agreed with her that this is kind of a surprising time to talk about democratic deterioration. We wouldn't believe that would be what we would be talking about 10 years ago, or certainly not 20 years ago. But at the same time, it wasn't so obvious. Why are we surprised? What is so particularly bad in this day and age? Samuel Huntington, one of the kind of founding people of political science, wrote this book, The Third Wave of Democratization, in 1991, where he described how democracies have evolved in waves. So they come, if you look up to the screen, they came about in the first wave, a couple of dozens of of mainly European, Western countries turned into democracies, electoral democracies, and later liberal democracies as a wave, but as in waves, not that I'm an expert on how the sea works in any way, but if waves tend to come back with their backwaters. Some of it comes back as well. It moves forward and then it flows back to some extent as well. So in the 20s and 30s, a lot of these countries reversed back to authoritarianism. A second wave of democratization happened after the end of colonialism and the independence movements. Similarly, in the 60s and 70s, some of those reversed back to authoritarianism. And a third wave, what Huntington described as being in the middle of in 1991, and we can say that that might have ended in the mid-90s after the end of the Soviet Union and the independence and democratization of those states. Many of those turned into democracies as well. So it's not surprising that some of these countries go back into authoritarianism and that this is not a linear process. That's something we've known for a long time, and that's not particularly, I mean, it might be worrying, but it's not something that should be surprising. What might be more surprising, I think both Janet and Tom pointed to this, is that we have a reversal of liberal democracy. So a lot of the values and a lot of those countries that we considered as established democracies, they are now slipping up, and we didn't expect that. And I think that unexpected part and the fact that many of these countries were seen as bastions of democracy, that makes it particularly striking. The United States has received a heavy blow in its score in its liberal democracy index. This is taken from Varieties of Democracy Project, an expert-coded survey, the biggest one that uses local experts from all countries in the world to place them from the early 20th century until today. And the United States has, depressingly, had a negative turn in the last few years. And that might be what is worrying, that many of those countries, both in the US and in Western Europe, they are going back. Also, we've seen 12 consecutive years in which there are more countries that have declined in terms of their freedom score, the extent to which they have liberal freedoms that are essential for democracy, than those that have made advancements. So we have seen a global reversal in terms of democratic scores, and that might be worrying. The fact that it's happening globally and on an aggregate level, but also that it's happening in the core countries, those that claim to be espousing democratic values and bringing those to other countries. Whether they actually did that at any point, that's another question. But the fact that they claim to do so, and now they're themselves not upholding those standards. So a final remark is, one thing that might be worrying about this is the reversal of democracy, what is the analogy that is appropriate for it? Is it like a tornado in which we have to, a tornado can be terrible, but it's a bump. It's a bump in the road. We have to brace ourselves, wait for it to pass, take the necessary precautions, but then things are going to go back to normal. Or is it like global warming, where if you brace yourself, it's just going to get worse. At some point you have to face it. You have to make structural changes, and it's hard to know exactly how we should, what diagnosis we should put on what is happening. A fear could be that it's like what the French do when they cook frogs. I've never done that myself, but apparently the wrong way to do that is to boil water and then put the frog inside, because the frog can then bounce back up, or they found a way of immediately feeling that the water is so warm that they get out. But the best way to do it is put them in room-tempered water so they don't feel anything. Then you put it to boil, it gradually increases, they don't feel the temperature change, and finally they die. And this might be a particular worry that this is what is happening today. Because as one of these many books that come out about democracy and the decline of democracy today, the one that I really like is one by two Harvard professors, Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, and they describe how that they say that democracies, they don't die under military rule anymore. They used to do that. So democracies have always died, but they've done so very clearly. No one pretended that the 1980 coup in Turkey was a democratic one. It was very clear that it was autocratic. We knew what it was. But the gradual critique of opposition, the delegitimization of opposition and of media, and of these fundamental freedoms, and doing that in a gradual way, and fighting democracy through winning elections, that might be what we're seeing in the US and many other places, and that's more scary. We might be like the frog who doesn't feel that the water is getting hotter and hotter. Okay, thank you.
It's my pleasure now to turn the podium over to Dr. Elaine May, and we look forward to her remarks.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I don't have any direct connections to Norway, I have to say, and for all of the nice words about Minnesotans, and I have been here a long time, but I can't claim Minnesota nice because I grew up in Los Angeles, so whatever you think about that. But I've been here long enough that when I go back to Los Angeles now and I see the billboards, I blush, so I must be turning into a Minnesotan. So the title of the forum for us tonight is a grim and disturbing one, and yet something I think we really do have to face. And I think the remarks by Tom and Jonas bring us to a real critical place in our discussion, which is the democracy here and elsewhere really in free fall? Or are there ways we can think that it might be reviving? And I'm an optimist by nature, which is why I think I'm very distressed right now, because my optimism is really being challenged in so many ways. I think that in the United States, which is the area that I study, we are facing a crisis of our democracy. And it did not begin with the election of 2016. And it did not begin with the crisis of September 11th, 2001, with the shocking attack that came from abroad. And I think it's been brewing for a long time, and there are certain things that Tom mentioned that really resonated with the work that I've done recently. One of them is the massive inequality and the decline of the middle class, and how that, I mean, I think that's the frog that's drowning slowly and heating up and doesn't even, the middle class hardly, feels it, but that's not at the top of people's agenda. And I think Tom also mentioned the tradition of individualism in the United States and how that can be a source of strength for us, but it can also be a source of, I think it can potentially be a source that weakens us as a democracy if people turn in too much to themselves and don't connect to the common good. And my own work sees the beginnings of this decline in the early years of the Cold War, a time when it seemed as though the country was coming together and the middle class was flourishing, and it seemed as though things were going well. We seemed to have a political consensus. Our two mainstream parties weren't that all divided as they are today. There was prosperity in the country. Things were seen to be getting better. But when I looked at below the surface of what was going on in our country then, I began to discover that starting in the early Cold War, Americans began to be afraid. They became afraid of the realities of the atomic age. So the bomb could drop at any moment, and where do you turn? The government can't protect you. No one can protect you. There was a civil defense bureaucracy telling people silly things, like, like stock your basement, or, build a shelter, or duck and cover, like some of us did when we were children in school, as if anybody really believed that if a bomb dropped, they were going to be able to save themselves in these ways. But the one thing the government was telling people, and the civil defense officials, was, you're on your own. Find your own way to safety. And there was no way to safety if a bomb had dropped. So there's this undercurrent of fear. And who are you afraid of? Well, there's the Russians out there, but there's the subversives in the country. And the level of anti-communist hysteria was not limited to Senator Joseph McCarthy, the orchestrator of McCarthyism. It was in the hearts and souls of individuals in the country who didn't know who was against them and who was for them. And this fear of the internal enemy, which the Cold War political culture really fostered. And this was not a partisan thing. The Democrats were just as fanatically anti-communist as the Republicans, and nobody was really outside of that unless they were willing to risk their own stature in the society. So you go back to this notion of internal enemies, and it continues. The fear of the other, the fear of the person next to you might be a communist, the person teaching your children, the person working in the State Department. They all might be somehow working against you. That idea begins to kind of wane, but then we get fears of other people, fears of criminals, fears of people setting cities on fire in the 1960s. I mean, there were huge uprisings in the cities. And then, of course, you begin to have the increasing diversity in the country and the civil rights movement going from nonviolent to a more militant posture, creating a backlash there. Fear of the other, fear of who's going to harm you, fear of who's walking behind you, who might hurt you. And then we have the feminist movement and the backlash against that. So by the late 60s and 70s, the media is filled with warnings to women. Don't go out in public. The person standing next to you might rape you, might attack you, might rob you. And women are particularly vulnerable. Don't think just because you're a feminist that you're strong. Go back home where you're safe. Were women safe back home? Statistically, women at that time and today are much safer in the middle of a dark alley in the middle of the night than they are in their own homes, where most violence against women takes place. But if you read the media, the message was exactly the opposite. So again, what's happening here? It's fear. It's fear of the unknown, it's fear of the stranger. And as we become more locked up in our own sense of only individuals can protect themselves, the government can't protect you, no one can save you, get yourself a gun. Americans are good at that. Get yourself a gun, protect yourself, because no one else will protect you. And in addition, pretty much everybody else is a potential attacker. So you begin to see a decline in trust between citizens. People don't trust each other. They don't trust people who are different from them. They get afraid. And what happens? What happens to our democracy? You need to have a sense of trust. You need to have a belief in the common good. You need to have a belief that you're part of a community that works together for a better society. You need to believe that the person who doesn't look like you has the same goals and values and dreams that you do, and they're not interested in harming you. They're interested in a stronger country and a stronger future. Now, going back to Tom's major point, the more that you're afraid of your neighbor who you don't necessarily know, the more you're afraid of other people, the more you're distracted from the real dangers to your own security, which is this terrible gap, growing gap between the very wealthy and everybody else, the decline of the middle class. And that has disappeared into the ether in this culture of fear that we're living in. And I think that this more than half a century of fear is what has driven us to be a country that no longer seems to have a sense of the common good. And that, I think, is the biggest threat to our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Not uplifting either. So I'm just between the charts and the walk down memory lane there, I think we're adequately scared, as you say. Well, Jonas, you've now had more than 5 minutes to get your answer to your first question, so you should be ready and succinct. Let me change it a little bit because this is always an organic program. So, in light of Dr. May's premise that the erosion of democracy is really founded on fear, our fear of others. Okay, so I'm going to kind of change your question a little bit. Give us a really quick tour of, how do you compare what's going on in Europe to here? I mean, how do you compare sort of the level of angst in Europe to us? But also, the EU looks like the most integrated, community you can have. Is there a level of fear? Is there a distrust going on that is eroding there? I mean, try to kind of combine those both if you can. I mean, to kind of respond to the question about fear.
Sure. I think Elaine's point about fear is absolutely relevant to Europe. I think the situation in Europe is worse and better at the same time when it comes to dealing with diversity and what the state is actually supposed to be about. I think it's better in the sense that the extreme levels of xenophobia and racism might not be as prevalent, or they might not have the same expression and violent expression, arguably, to the same extent as in the US. But it's worse in the sense that the really progressive and those who have been thinking about these questions for a longer time in the US, they are much further ahead than their equivalent, or the people who are also on the left or are progressive in Europe. So I think the average is maybe the same, but it's the variance is just much bigger in the US. I think it's the reason for that is that you have understanding other people, understanding diversity. It's very hard to do when you have a non-diverse community. Sadly, I wish that was something. I wish we could teach ourselves to not be racist, to not be sexist. I would never have learned anything about that if everyone around me were like me. If everyone were white men around me, I would know nothing about it. And that's the case for most European societies. Their whole, whatever lip service they're paying to diversity now, a lot of it is based on assimilation. And that is because you don't really have those voices saying why it's problematic that they're making these assumptions, that people have to become exactly the way they are. That's in Norway you accept migrants. Even people on the center left would accept migrants and say it's great to have diversity. But at the same time, they want them to eat brunost and to wear the same woolen sweaters that a lot of you are wearing tonight. That's based on the premise of assimilation. Why do you have to wear that? That's the government party in Norway is saying more or less that. In Norway we eat lutefisk. Like, I've never eaten lutefisk in my life. but they would never criticize me because I'm white and I'm born here. So it's a proxy for racism, and they have found. So in a way, it's better than in Europe and than in the US because they're not using all these direct racist slurs, but the content is worse than what it is for the equivalent center left in the US.
Okay. Dr. May, I'm going to, again, build on because you came in with clearly a theory on this. So you are a national or international expert on the end of the Cold War, but also the end of it. So as you look at it, would you say our democracy was as challenged in the Cold War as it is now? In other words, we're just changing the labels of who we're afraid of under your premise. Or would you say, no, it's more linked to the inequality of income, and that's been like an accelerator on this. So, because many people kind of wax nostalgically for the 50s. You know, we all voted, and nobody argued about religion and politics, and and I mean, we always get nostalgic, but the enemy was out there, and it wasn't in here. So, do you think it's very similar to during the Cold War? We just have changed labels, or do you think it is somewhat of a different era now?
It's really a great question, Janet, and I think some might wonder if we just look at American domestic culture, whether the Cold War really ever ended, because we had different eras during the Cold War. Sure, in the 50s, things on the surface looked nice because black people were segregated in the South and being oppressed, and women were relegated to the home and being frustrated, and we had huge amount of drug addiction in the 1950s, and most of the addicts were women, and they were addicted to pills and alcohol out of frustration because their opportunities were so limited. And so the pretty picture of the 50s hides a lot of distress. And by the time we get to the 60s and things began to kind of surface and become apparent, we were still right in the midst of the Cold War, and yet we had a very divided country in many ways. And I think that we've had divisions within the country during the Cold War, early, middle, and late Cold War, and also since. And, the question of whether we needed to have an external enemy to bring us together, we weren't really that all together when we had the enemy of the Soviet Union, and then when we ended up being a post-Cold War country, a lot of the legacy of our internal domestic life continued.
Jonas, we're approaching the time when I want to open it up to the floor because we get good questions from the floor. But your specialty is the Middle East, and we're lucky to have you here, especially in light of the last month or so with the issues of assassinations in Turkish embassies. We don't think of the Middle East as the poster child for democracy, but how would you evaluate? I mean, is it moving? Is there enough going on with Arab Spring and Egypt and a few other places? Is there a younger generation? Is there any potential? Do you see that being part of the new, bringing that line up again, the fourth wave? Do you see that in parts of the world where we wouldn't necessarily see it today? Or do you say it'll be the last one to come around?
That's a great question. I wish I could answer that and be certain about that answer being correct. I think it's almost 8 years since the Arab Spring, and it's really striking how quickly we forget, even people like me who do research on the Middle East, how the atmosphere and kind of optimism turns to pessimism and the other way around. Until 2011, all the literature on the Middle East, about politics of the Middle East, were explaining authoritarianism. So they were all predicting status quo, predicting that they would continue to be, all these countries would continue to be authoritarian, and they were trying to explain why the Middle East was an exception. And then suddenly, albeit for a brief period, this was turned on its head. You know, large parts of the population in these countries seem to have attitudes and seem to be willing to mobilize in favor of those attitudes towards democracy, and that seemed to be the destiny for many of these countries. That is now has reversed back to authoritarianism. You know, that the only thing that teaches me is that I have to be very careful about what I should predict for the future. I mean, the basic underlying things that are happening in the Middle East and that were underlying the Arab Spring, I think one essential part of that is the young population and the young, relatively educated population that were driving forces behind these protests. None of those problems are solved by these authoritarian regimes, and the population is still very young. There are mechanisms in places like Egypt, for sure, that seem to completely repress any potential mobilization, so the window of opportunity might not be there. And I'm going there next week, so I wish I went there last week so I could tell you a little bit more firsthand. But that's my impression. It's very hard to do anything practically, but the underlying desires and the underlying grievances that really are the fuel for anything like this are still there. So that could happen. You know, if the window of opportunity changes, and it could quickly, then maybe.
Okay. Well, we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience, and I'm going to invite Tom to join us. So feel free if you have a question for Tom or either of our two panelists. And while we're bringing the questions up, I'm going to, Tom, give you a softball. Thank you. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, Tom is, while he's served in a number of parts of the world, he is an expert on the Soviet Union and on post-Soviet Russia and some of the other client states there. So, Tom, with that as your background, you know, a lot of our questions and concerns are what's happening internally in some of our most trusted allies who appear to be liberal democracies for a long time, and now are they unraveling and are we? But that's an internal look. We can also have attacks on our democracy from the outside. So, I mean, either one. You can have erosion and corrosion on the inside, or you can also have attacks from the outside. So I would just like you to give a little bird's eye view of what is, as far as you know, what is Russia's, not only their aspiration, but their capability to precipitate attacks on democracies here or in other countries, or democratic institutions even?
Well, all states right now are using and studying the new technologies that are emerging that allow the kind of intrusions we've seen here in the last couple of years. You know, all through the Cold War, disinformation, information warfare was a part of the deal. I mean, the United States in the 50s had a very active disinformation, I'm not sure that's the right word, but journalists, scholars working for the CIA, monitoring, trying to influence labor movements in Italy. Italy was the big focus in the 50s, that they might tip in a communist direction. Similarly, the Russians had an active disinformation campaign. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a brief period in the 90s under Yeltsin when they were really caught up with their own problems, and we very much encouraged Yeltsin to use his own oligarchs, who at that time controlled the media in Russia, to influence the political situation there. So, for example, the United States urged Yeltsin to clamp down on the media before one of the elections. I believe it was in 1993 already. So it's been going back and forth, back and forth. Russia is, to my mind, in a defensive mode right now, ever since the expansion of NATO and coming up toward Ukraine and Georgia, they feel that our very active promotion of democracy, what we have called transformational diplomacy, has, in a way, and the activities of non-governmental organizations within their own borders, from their point of view, is something they see as an intrusion into their domestic affairs. For the values we believe in, it's a very necessary intrusion. It's something that has a lot of support from citizens in Russia who want their country to be more democratic, but the government sees it as an assault. When Hillary Clinton very clearly sort of weighed in publicly about the re-election of Yeltsin, or rather of Putin, I think at that point the Russians upped their disinformation campaign using the new technologies, fake news. They'd cut their teeth on this in the Baltic states and elsewhere. They perfected these methods that they eventually used on us. So here we are in this new situation. Now, there are a lot of rabbit holes today. These go very deep. There was a big dump of WikiLeaks documents in the last spring, which, including some very highly classified NSA, National Security Agency documents, which show that the U.S. can mimic online any actor. And other governments have the same capability. You know that Fancy Bear intruded in our election. You don't really know who Fancy Bear is. It becomes conjectural just because of the way the internet operates. So it's a hall of mirrors. And I'm concerned because, as I mentioned, the technology is going further. And you just wait. We're going to be dealing now with deep fakes. This is the new frontier. The ability now to fake streaming video images to the point where you really cannot tell which ones are fake and which ones are real. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency of the U.S., is fully focused on this now. The idea, and it's called GAN, Generative Adversarial Networks, to be able to produce totally realistic videos and to be able to detect false ones. In the midst of a crisis, you could have some fake video appear, totally realistic, which could tip the whole crisis. You know, before World War I, the Zimmerman telegram surfaced, and it was part of why we got into World War I, because this was a document that people suddenly saw. So it's just something we're going to have to do. I think there's got to be agreements. I think states have got to get together now to try to negotiate an arms control agreement on this new tech and on the ability to interfere in each other's domestic politics.
Well, we have a lot of great questions. So I'm going to start, and Jonas, I'll start with you since you're in an academic institution and we're going to press you on that. It's great to talk about the deterioration or the degeneration of democracy, but how do you measure it? What are some key measures you could look at to give some kind of comparison to, either where we've been or where we're going?
So that's a great question. I think there's no consensus about the best way of doing this or whether this is really possible. And the attempts that are made, there's more pragmatism in using them rather than thinking that this is the best possible way to do it, or it is the best possible way to do it, but it's not perfect. The one that I was referring to in my introductory remarks, that's Varieties of Democracy, that is the most, and I think the best attempt to date at measuring or describing what is happening year by year in most countries of the world. They have experts who are asked very specific questions. So when it comes to liberal democracy, you have questions of whether press offices have been shut down, whether certain members of the press have been fired without a valid reason. I don't know all the specific questions, but there are specific questions in those directions. So about the ballot box and about elections, there are very specific questions about what was happening there. There could be a lot of biases there. There are still humans who are putting these scores from 1 to 10 or from 0 to 1. But they are cross-validating them with between different experts, and those are country experts. And I think that's the best way of doing it so far.
Okay, and then I'll volunteer since I won't have to do it. When we do our write-up for our newsletter for the Norway House on our program, we will put a couple of these citations available, like Freedom Now and some of these that you referred to. So again, part of being informed is getting the real facts and
yes. So
we'll do that.
If I can just add to that, I think Freedom House, they have for sure they have interesting information as well. What is really good for VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, is that you don't need the statistical know-how or the programmatic know-how to do that with statistics. You can go on their online generator and play around with that with different countries and different indicators over time. So it's pretty easy to do that and pretty intuitive. So that's interesting if you want to do that research yourself at home.
Okay. Dr. May, we have kind of a twofold question for you. It's fairly ambitious. So how do you fix the problem of the 1%? So how do we reduce the income inequality in our country? What are some steps that could be taken that would reduce the decline of the middle class or the growing gap between incomes? But then they doubled it with, can we actually harness what you suggested, fear? Can we harness that to strengthen our democracy rather than undermine it? For instance, through social media and that, can we create a greater fear of the ruling class instead of the other in society? I don't know if you want to just switch it to whoever, but anyway, double question there.
I believe in politics. I believe that politics is a good thing. I feel that active citizens create the world around them. Active citizens are the ones who can breathe life into the democracy. Vote, elect representatives who are going to change the policies that lean in one direction or another. You know, we've had a politics now for a long time of neoliberalism and market-driven ideas about capitalism that have really handed over the wealth of the country to the top 1%, and everyone else seems to have kind of rolled over in the face of that steamroller and been distracted by things that are really much less likely to harm them. And so I think that in the past, we have seen people in the country rise up and say, no, we're not going to have unregulated capitalism. We're not going to have a tax code that favors only the rich. We're not going to allow wealth to go through the ceiling for the very rich, and everyone else just falls to the ground. So I think that citizenship and activism and seizing the political reins can do a lot. I think we're beginning to see some of that now. I think that there is there's real evidence of discontent that is surfacing. We've seen it in the streets. We saw it in the elections. And it's a new kind of fierce activism that is emerging in the country. And I think that that's a good thing. I think people need to take their country back.
This is a question, I think, for all three of you, so feel free to jump in. Tom, you touched on artificial intelligence and technology and what a threat that can be, and also how social media can isolate individuals. But social media can also create a huge global platform very quickly. Do you see any opportunity for either people or organizations who are committed to democracy using social media to make to get the frog aware that the temperature is on and the burner is on?
Well, I'll just quickly respond if you have ideas too. Yes, the potential is definitely there. So far, if you look, for instance, at the Arab Spring, I think that social media was very good at bringing people out, at organizing protests, maybe played less of a role than in the next phase of having to actually organize the new political situation and implement some of the the desires that were expressed in the demonstrations. And I think that so far social media is proving to be a better mobilizer than it is an institutionalizer, if you may. This doesn't mean it has to always be that way. I mean, if groups can use it in innovative ways. Certainly, President Obama was a good example of using social media. President Trump is a good example. He's using Twitter, to his advantage. So yes, the potential is there. I mean, the problem is that our media landscape is so fragmented with so many echo chambers that to get the message out beyond the immediate group you're trying to mobilize to a broader public, it remains a challenge in my view.
Yeah, I think I agree with Tom that this is more of a mobilizer than an organizer. I think that's a good way of putting it. I'm also, this is not my area of expertise, but I can't decide whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about the potential of social media. I think the research is really divergent, and some of it shows that there are these echo chambers, and they might further and deteriorate in terms of creating polarization in societies, that people only see opinions that they agree with. But I've also seen one of these recent experiments that show that those who are exposed to opposing views actually double down on their views. So that could be an increasingly polarizing thing as well. It's hard for me to take a clear stance on this. I think it can go either way.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the next question, because this would be for both Professor Draege and Professor May. You've both talked about fear of the other, or in the case of migration, or just the history of fear of the other. So here's an interesting question. As the U.S. minority becomes the majority, as our mix of groups changes, do you see this impacting degeneration? Will it be a positive or a negative? In other words, we've been talking about the middle class sinking and losing confidence, and that is the fodder for fascism. Is there a reverse to that, which is as you get more diverse people who have had more challenging backgrounds, will they be more of a fertilizer to improve and maintain our democracy? Either one, don't jump at it. It's a good question that deserves an answer, or at least it's speculation. Sure. You don't have to be perfect here, just speculation.
Yes.
And apparently succinct.
I can't be as succinct, but I think, I don't really, I don't understand which minority is becoming the majority. I don't know if I really understand that question. Where that would be the case, that there is a minority that's becoming the majority. Which minority is that?
Well, it would be non-white in the United States.
So non-whites would become the majority.
Yeah. That's already happened.
Yeah.
So
will this be bring on, perhaps in the United States, the fourth wave, or not? That's their question. Is that an optimistic or element or not?
Maybe. I think the danger is the transitioning period. The danger is never status quo. I think it's relative deprivation. So whenever someone is losing something, regardless of whether they have which position they're in, if you are in a position of privilege and you're losing a little bit of that feels terrible, even if by absolute means you're still ahead of everyone else. I think the change is what is scary for democracy. It's not whatever status quo ends up being.
I'm going to interject my own question because it's been prompted by somebody here, and then I'm going to go to theirs. Tom, I think you touched on lack of education in our schools on civics. Okay. All three of you have a reason. You're all in academia in one way or another. I've had this theory for a long time that one of our big problems is we have stopped recognizing that we need both an economic system and a political system. We have turned capitalism into the be-all and end-all, when our country is really based on a democratic political system and a capitalistic economic system. And you have a natural tension between them, and that's what sort of kept us in the middle. And somewhere in the last few decades, we just dropped off this idea of even thinking about our political system, and anything and everything that supports capitalism must be right because we're a capitalist country. Are you seeing students who have grown up never knowing that they have to nurture and take care of their political system or they won't have it? I mean, what are you seeing in college students in terms of their understanding of political system versus economic system?
You know, in the last decades, there's been it's been a tautology that capitalism and democracy go together, and that's been the whole idea of our transformational diplomacy, the way we approached Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the idea that by bringing very deregulated markets to countries, that would automatically then lead to capitalism. And so I think that tautology is very deep in our consciousness right now, more than it was in our earlier history. You know, what's good for General Motors is good for America, and then the rest follows from that. And of course, now there is a question of how capitalism and democracy come together, because models that people call authoritarian capitalism are outperforming. You know, there are many capitalist elements in China. Nazi Germany had capitalist elements. Corporate fascism is a way of organizing. So I think that there is this questioning going on. I'm worried, though, which way it's going. I see a lot of even young Americans now kind of battening down the hatches and focusing on their personal development, on making sure that they themselves succeed, and their parents nowadays. Believe me, somebody in liberal arts, to try to convince a student to take a liberal arts class nowadays, when their parent is hovering over their shoulder, is this going to get you a job? It's part of the crisis in the liberal arts that's going on right now. I see a lot of students aware that international possibilities are important, future jobs. They want to be involved locally, but the whole national level, they just are not interested in. They don't want to participate in that. So that somehow has got to change. You know, a lot of recent polling has shown that among millennials, when they're asked to name the values they hold to be most important, democracy is pretty far down the list. And there's a huge discrepancy between the boomer generation and this younger generation of Americans on that. And I think it comes from this idea that's been raised, that Elaine raised so clearly about trust. You know, our system does seem to many young people to be a rigged game, quite frankly. They see the money in politics. They see the negative advertising. We can only dream of a country like Norway where that's all illegal, basically. Everything is, there's no campaign financing. There's no advertising on TV. It's it's a different society, but still. So, no, I think then, and so one of the key, I'll just conclude, say that one of the key goals really should be to educate our younger generations on the importance of democracy and make this a conscious effort, a priority, because it doesn't happen on its own.
Elaine, or do you want to comment?
I mean, I just agree with Tom.
Okay.
I also just agree with Tom. So.
Boy, the art of persuasion, Tom. Well, this is our last question, and the reason I asked that first one is this one builds on that, and we always like to end on a higher note if we can than dystopia. So the person asked a question a certain way, but I'm going to kind of amend it a little bit. What they say is, in the third wave, we had the creation of the World Bank, the IMF, and other institutions to help fund the changes that we hoped would lead to democracy around the world. And so our questioner from the audience says, can we use these upcoming anniversaries as a way to restore these institutions as institutions who can bring about and support democracy? I'm going to change it a little and say, do you think those institutions did, or would you say there's new and different kinds of institutions we need in order to bring about the same surge of stability and economic improvement around the world that we saw through these institutions? Because some people think these institutions helped create the income inequality. So anyway, so do you like these institutions and think that we should promote them, or are there different kinds of institutions we need for the future?
Is that a question for me?
Whoever wants to. Yes.
Yeah, that's hard. That's a very good question. I think that's hard for me to answer whether this is really that time, whether that is the atmosphere we're facing today, and that optimism of capitalism and liberalism, and how that would naturally spread with just a little bit of help from international institutions. I do not think that is the critical factor to democratize countries. I think democratization mainly happens domestically, mainly happens from the inside of those countries. It's very hard to do something that is consequential in democratization processes. There are ways of stopping it, of blocking it, or spurring it on, but the main force comes from the inside.
Just two points on that. 1945 is a long time ago, and that's when these institutions were founded. I think they've done good over the decades, but it's a very different world economy now, and they have not been ahead of the game in bringing in countries like China, India, Brazil, which really represent a greater part of the world economy now. And as a result, those countries are beginning to create their own institutions, especially the Chinese, and with regard to their new Silk Road project, all kinds of things. So there's a kind of fragmentation of those institutions going on anyway. I think that we underestimate what the UN has been doing. You know, the Millennium Development Goals from 2000 to 2015 actually produced tremendous results in the developing world. If you look at the statistics on health, longevity, all kinds of things. And now we have the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. I personally find those almost more relevant today to the kind of changes in democratization, if you will, in the world. And I think we should give the UN more credit.
You get the last comment.
I don't know a lot about those institutions. The only real fact or trend that seems really clear around the world is that countries do better all over the world when women and girls have access to education.
Well, and that's more than just a feel-good comment. We did a program on that several years ago, and there are incredible statistics on what that does to reduce violence and increase childhood education and the opportunities for all. So it's one of the top factors in terms of, first of all, stabilizing and then creating a ground-up economy. It frequently starts with women. So, great, good. Well. It was more upbeat than I thought. we got there. So, okay. Well, again, mindful of your time, I want to first of all thank our panelists and for a very engaging evening. So, thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause. We have a special gift for each of you, and this is always the time when I start looking around and panicking and thinking, oh, did we get it? And then Robin comes through with it. So we have, because of our program, which is here in Minnesota, and we're very appreciative of people who come here, especially this time of year. But we're very appreciative of the roots of our culture that come from our Native American family members in our state and the role that they had in peacemaking and how important efforts on their part were to symbolize the role of peacemaking, and especially through their native peace pipes, which has become a symbol for our Minnesota Peace Initiative. And so we have them handmade for each of our speakers. And those who have been here before have seen them, but they're made from our native pipestone material right here from our state. And it is in a lovely box that denotes your participation in our program tonight. And we hope each of you will keep it as a keepsake of a lovely evening, and we appreciate all you did to make that evening. So it's yours, and we will, for those traveling, send them. And we just want you to know how much we appreciate all you did. So. I also want to thank our Minnesota Peace Initiative Committee. Several members are here. We couldn't put on these programs without them, and even though by the time we get to our evening, you would think that this topic was self-evident, and it usually is. It usually is pretty close to what is really on the minds of everyone at the time. But we do begin with a whole list of topics, and we narrow it down. And so it's a lot of work, but we have a great time, and anybody who would be interested in joining our committee, I think we all agree it's probably the most fun committee any of us have ever served on. So we really enjoy you and welcome you if you want to take part. We also have a number of members of the Norway House leadership team here and the board of directors. And I encourage all of you, if you aren't already, on the mailing list and the email list for the Norway House, and there are a number of important events there. And right now, the gingerbread house display has just opened, and it is a huge success. So if you have any interest, and particularly if you have children and grandchildren, it's a fabulous thing to do over the holiday season. And last, I would like to thank, in particular, Larry Bakken, who is, Larry, will you stand up? He never wants to be designated, but okay. Larry is not only a member of the Norway House board, but he is the head of the Minnesota Peace Initiative and a relentless, again, like Tom, a relentless world traveler. I talked to him, and I was in India, and the phone call said it was coming from maybe Australia or New Zealand, and he was in Lithuania. So I said, where are you? And he said, I'm in Lithuania. I said, well, apparently your cell is bouncing off of Australia to get here. So he's just a terrific leader of the Minnesota Peace Initiative, so we really appreciate all that you do, Larry. And Tom, you are a very special member, not only of our Norway House community and our Minnesota Peace Initiative community, but just our whole foreign affairs community here, and you're a real treasure, and we really appreciate all the knowledge that you bring to our programs. And I encourage all of you to come to our program next May. Those of you who are regulars, we do a program in May, usually around 17 Mai, and then we do a program in November. So we will be having a program in May. I encourage all of you to come. We haven't picked a topic because we haven't even begun to think about it, other than we think the topic we had tonight is big enough and broad enough, and most importantly, is serious enough that we may do an even deeper dive and do a two-part program on this topic. We haven't just decided, but, and also just when you listen to the news, things are happening all the time that are in this whole arena of what's happening to democracy around the world. So we haven't decided, but there's a good chance that we'll delve even deeper into this topic for our next topic. So I hope that once we come out of the doldrums of winter and spring is here, you will join us for our next program. Thank you all very much. Have a lovely evening. Safe travels.